Sorry Mr. Cawl, but I don't think that you got this one. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're going to be putting every single faction leader in Warhammer 40k through their paces, throwing them into the ring with the Red Angel of the World Eaters and seeing who comes out on top. It's going to be interesting to see just how far Angron's obscene combat stats get him when he's facing up against the best of the best from around the 41st millennium. In today's video, rather than talking any sort of in-depth tactics for Angron on the field, we're just going to be doing a bit more of a damage contest for fun and seeing who will triumph in glorious single combat. It doesn't necessarily determine which model is best, of course. In real games of 40k there's more going on, and a lot of these faction leaders greatly help out their armies as well as fight hard. It is kind of interesting to see the results in single combat though, which might or might not be what you expect. I've done a couple of these contests before, one with the Avatar of Khaine versus everyone, and one with Abaddon the Despoiler. I did have a feeling that we'd be making another video like this when Angron came out, and I'm glad that I've had time to get round to it. For the rules of the fight, we're taking all the faction commanders in 40k, things like the Silent King or Roboute Guilliman, and for armies that don't have an obvious one, I've generally just taken one fancy named character who's fairly good in a scrap. There wasn't anyone particularly obvious for Harlequins, Chaos Knights or Genestealer Cult yet, no named characters in any of those factions, though by popular demand after the first contest I have included the Nightbringer as well, as perhaps a particularly interesting foe to try and bring down the biggest and the best. As with last time, we'll go by the same rules. Each model gets a round of psychic, shooting and melee, and we'll do a bit of maths to average out how much damage they can expect. We run a few numbers, and then the model that kills the greatest percentage of the opponent's defense wins, perhaps aiming to be a little bit more scientific than just who wins any one dice off. For the characters involved, they get their warlord traits and any obvious army-wide special rules that they normally have access to, but we are keeping stratagems out of it. There are just far too many options for too many armies. We're going to leave the command points out of it this time. As for our combatant who's going to be facing off against all of these big nasties, we have Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, 360 points as a Lord of War choice, and he does have a rather impressive stat line. He moves 16 inches, hits on 2s, and is at least somewhat tough with toughness 7, a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, and 18 wounds. Really his raw melee damage output though is perhaps the most impressive thing. 12 attacks going up to 13 with Relentless Rage, and either hitting with a slash attack that's strength 15, AP -4 and damage D3 +3, he gets an extra pip of strength from Relentless Rage, or he can elect to sweep, getting triple the attacks at strength user AP -3 and damage 1. A crazy 39 attacks at strength 10 there, and this is actually the best profile for taking down at least a fair chunk of these characters, often having unnatural halving damage mechanics. Besides that, for one-on-one character duels there isn't all that much more going on. He gets to use his Champion of the Arena special rule on himself, so he can re-roll his hit roll, but his Wrathful Presence isn't really going to make any major effect, and as he's going in unsupported, the Blood Tithe isn't going to be relevant either. I feel like he's a model that's going to have some advantages but some disadvantages going into this. He doesn't really have that much synergies, so most of his points really are reflective of his combat stat line. But on the other hand, I feel like perhaps a fair few of his points might be going towards his ability to respawn, which is perhaps the scariest thing about him. You kill him, then he just keeps on popping up. Overall, something's going for him, something's a bit less so. It's hard to argue that he's got a truly ridiculous amount of melee damage to fight with though. Let's get into combat though, and first up let's cut our way through the great and the good of the Imperium, starting off with his brother Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines. Guilliman is perhaps fairly focused on command abilities more so than his brother. He still has a respectable combat stat line though, the Hand of Dominion shooting and the Emperor's Sword in combat. It works out quite close to the Hand of Dominion when he's fighting Angron. In defense, his armor gives him a 3+ invul save, and he has an interesting ability to return from death on a 4+ when he's killed. That does make him quite a hard prospect to overcome in duels like this. First up, getting into combat, Angron strikes with Samniarius and Spinegrinder. He gets his reroll 1s to hit as his Champion of the Arena, and using his damage D3 +3 slash profile, he averages 17.5 wounds on Guilliman, even despite that 3+ invul save. It's very highly likely that Guilliman's going to be dead after this, and then he'll stand up on a 4+ with D6 wounds remaining, the Armour of Fate having done its job. It does mean that he's got a reasonable chance to be able to strike twice, after which Angron will get to attack back once more, and Guilliman will pretty much certainly be dead. Overall that's 194% damage over Guilliman's 9 wounds in any case. Then Guilliman strikes back, the Hand of Dominion opens up and deals 2 wounds to Angron, and the Emperor's Sword with the mortal wounds is pretty even with the Hand of Dominion in melee, averaging around 9 wounds on the Red Angel. That adds up to 11 wounds of Angron's total of 18, but then he gets that 50-50 chance to stand up again with the Armour of Fate. We'll take the average of that with a 50% chance to deal 11 wounds as 5.5 wounds, so in total you can expect around about 16 or 17 wounds on Angron, almost killing him but not quite. All of this adds up to 91% damage on the Red Angel versus the 194% Angron's dealt to Guilliman. A pretty convincing win for Khorne here, and even if you wait for points a bit, it's still a hefty victory to Angron over Guilliman. I thought it would be interesting to see if any of the characters, even if they didn't actually manage to beat Angron in single combat, might be good enough to hold it their own against him point for point, even if they can't one for one. In any case, it looks like Guilliman's been cast down by his Demon Primarch brother. Next up, we've got Morvenn Vahl, 280 points, as the Supreme Commander of the Adeptus Sororitas. She's a High Lord of Terror who fights from a Paragon Warsuit, attacking with a relic spear called the Lance of Illumination, a big damage 3 and strength 8 in combat, and she can allow herself her own rerolls, allowing her to reroll all failed hits and wounds. She'll also take the Sacred Rite for the Exploding Sixes. She's got a decent amount of firepower between some missile launchers and her relic heavy bolter Fidelis. She does have some decent defense built into the Warsuit as well, a 2+ save with a 4+ invul, and halves incoming damage with some defense against mortal wounds. That defense though really isn't going to be enough to stop Angron. Using the strike profile of Samniarius and Spinegrinder, the raw damage is still enough to overcome Mrs. Vahl, 16 wounds compared with her total of 8, a bit more exactly it comes to around 197% damage. On the counter-strike, Morvenn Vahl's ranged weapons actually are fairly decent into Angron, the missile launcher and Fidelis causing 4 wounds in total, and then the Lance of Illumination in combat isn't bad, but not quite as outstanding, doing another 5.4 wounds there. Morvenn Vahl can fight again if she survives to the end of the fight phase, but unfortunately it really doesn't look like she's going to when Angron's dealt her a death blow in one attack, so she's left with just 9.5 wounds of 18 dealt to Angron, and it winds up being 197%, plays 53. It's a little bit better after waiting for points, but still not quite as good as Guilliman. Next up, we've got Captain General Trajann Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes, 200 points as a unique character. He's a solid general all-round combatant, striking with 6 attacks at strength 10 and damage 3 with the Watcher's Axe, and fairly hard to kill in combat as well, with a 4+ invul save, and a 5+ feel no pain against wounds taken. He's got a couple of helpful special rules as well. He gets to reroll his melee hit rolls for a Warlord trait, and the Moment Shackle can be quite a big deal in combat, changing a single saving throw to a damage characteristic of 0, probably the best use of it here. Into battle, and Angron's melee deals 14 wounds with the slash mode, a little bit less than either Vahl or Guilliman. Perhaps the major difference here is that the Moment Shackle just nullifies one failed save, and then he's got this 5+ feel no pain against the rest. It's not enough to save him unfortunately, 14 wounds versus 8, but it certainly isn't quite so bad. Unfortunately, he doesn't really have quite as much melee to keep up with some of the other previous combatants. The Watcher's Axe does a little bit of damage in shooting, and then an average of just over 5 wounds in melee. Nowhere really enough to worry Angron, only 5.6 wounds out of 18. Angron wins the contest, 174% damage to 31%, and it's still nowhere even close even if you wait for points. A 312% victory to Angron there. With the Lord Commander of the Imperium dead and 2 High Lords of Terror taken down too, let's move on to smashing some nerds. Belisarius Cawl is 160 points, and the Supreme Commander of the Adeptus Mechanicus, maybe aimed to be a bit more of a buffing character than a combat one, is fairly resilient on the defense with 8 wounds, a 2+ save, a -1 damage and a 4+ invul, but in terms of his actual combat ability is not quite as impressive. A decent close range anti-tank shot with the Solar Atomizer, D3 shots at strength 10 and damage 3, but his melee is a bit of a letdown unfortunately. He's only got his Arc Scourge or his Omniscient Axe, which are kind of even into Angron, plus a few anti-infantry Mechadendrites. Unfortunately for him, Angron really isn't going to have too much trouble cutting through Mr. Cawl. 21 wounds averaged with Samniarius and Spinegrinder, 21 wounds over his regular 8. Despite arguably okay defense, he's still the single deadest out of any of the characters so far. In return, Cawl definitely tries his best. The Solar Atomizer averages 1.7 wounds, and the Arc Scourge plus Mechadendrites deal another 1.8 in total. Still though, he's very much outclassed here. 19% damage versus 262, a pretty easy victory for Angron there. Nervously next into the ring is Lord Solar Leontus, by stepping up to the plate as a new Guard Supreme Commander. His saves Creed from getting quite as bullied as he was against the avatar of Khaine and Abaddon. Lord Solar is perhaps in a fairly similar kind of boat to Cawl though. He is an 170 point buffing character mainly, has a solid close range shooting attack in Soul's Righteous Gaze with damage 3 on that pistol, and his sword is the Blade of Conquest, it's strength 6, AP -3 and damage 2. Again, like Cawl, his defensive stats aren't really too bad. It's got 8 wounds, a 4+ invul save, and halving damage from his Refractor Helm. I guess that'll blunt Angron's attacks just a little bit. Again, kind of predictably, Lord Solar doesn't put up too much resistance to Angron. Samniarius and Spinegrinder deal 16 wounds, and this time it makes sense to use the sweep attack due to the half damage. Again, Lord Solar dead around about twice over. In return, he fares a little bit better than Cawl. Soul's Righteous Gaze averages 2 wounds and Conquest 2 as well. A total of 4 wounds out of 18, around about 22% damage versus 199 for Angron. Still a massive win for the Demon Primarch, as you might have guessed. Back to more challenging foes though, and next up we have Kaldor Draigo, Supreme Grandmaster of the Grey Knights, and to some degree I guess demons are his speciality. Draigo can strike with a dangerous Titan Sword, strength 8, AP -4 and damage 3, and he gets to reroll hit rolls due to his Chapter Master rule, and also wound rolls of 1 as well due to the Tide of the Warp chosen to be specific against fighting demons. He's also got a couple of different psychic powers, the first psychic that Angron's encountering here, and to be honest, mortal wounds and things are kind of bad news for him. He doesn't have any in-bait psychic defense unless the Blood Tithe gets going or he gets stratagems and things, so they will be kind of effective against Angron, much to his annoyance I'm sure. On the defensive, he's got 7 wounds, a 2+ save and a 3+ invul from his Relic Shield. And then we get on to the interesting bit, the Demon Slayer Warlord trait that he has, where he's going to get +1 attack as he counts as charging. And then there's the bit that Games Workshop kind of messed up a bit, as if you're making a melee attack against a demon unit, they've FAQ'd it to only ignore demon saving throws now and not invuls anymore. Kind of a big deal, as we'll see in a second. First up for Angron's attacks, he gets to reroll 1s to hit, and Samniarius and Spinegrinder deal 17.5 wounds again. That's the same amount as against Guilliman, another similar target with a 3+ save that Angron doesn't really care about the toughness of. Draigo can't stand toe-to-toe with the Red Angel and live. On the counter-attack though, Draigo does have a fairly impressive amount of damage. First up, he's got his Mastercrafted Stormbolter, chipping in for just over a wound. For the psychic powers, I decided to go with Vortex of Doom and Smite, decent Witchfires and averaging 4.2 wounds given the chance of failure. Then with his reroll wound rolls in place, the Titan Sword does an average of 6.8 wounds if it doesn't ignore invuls, as Games Workshop have written it at the moment, so that would mean a total of 12.3 wounds of Angron's 18, and averaging 68% damage. I would bear in mind though that it makes quite a big deal if you do use it as it was printed in the book. If the Titan Sword gets to ignore Angron's invul saves, then that'll go up to 19.1 wounds on Angron. He'd be able to say he's the first contestant that's actually managed to bring down Angron. Overall though, it's a victory for the Red Angel, 242% against 68. If you wait for points it does get quite a lot closer though, with Kaldor only being 165 points. That would make it an 160% victory to Angron. And Angron still just wins out, even if you do wait for points, and the Titan Sword does get to ignore Angron's invul save. Definitely a good effort, good to have some extra tricks against demons I guess. Lastly for the Imperium, we have the Imperial Knights, and I thought we'd use Canis Rex as our representative here. He's the Freeblade Chainbreaker, and he's basically bringing super heavy tools to the table, a Las Impulsor with a big anti-tank shot when shooting, and then Freedom's Hand, a massively powerful melee weapon, hitting on 2s with strength 16, AP -4 and a crazy big damage of 8, and Canis Rex even gets exploding 6s in melee and a single reroll once per battle. He also has the special rule as well that if he doesn't explode then Sir Hector gets out when he dies, a kind of neat little trick. In defense the main knight has got 24 wounds with toughness 8 and a 3+ save, not an enormous amount of durability in combat though without an invul. That lack of invul save certainly does cost Canis. With the great big slash attack, the damage D3+3 deals an average of 42 wounds to Canis Rex in one round of combat, not quite doubling out Canis Rex, but almost doing so. He's very dead. In return though, Canis Rex does have the tools to take down Angron. That Las Impulsor deals an average of 4 wounds, and then Freedom's Hand with a strike mode plus the exploding 6s, and the mortal wounds added on top, that stacks up to be around about 20+ wounds. He basically does have the raw numbers enough to kill Angron here between the two attacks, averaging 24 wounds out of Angron's 18, though Angron does win the percentage damage contest of 175 versus 136. Canis Rex actually costs more points than Angron, so I guess that would only add to Angron's weight of victory for that, But actually the determining factor of this one is the chance for Sir Hector to get out if the knight doesn't explode. So if you don't roll a 6 on the explosion result, basically both of these guys kill each other in combat, and then Sir Hector gets out the vast majority of the time. Due to that, despite not winning the percentage damage contest, it does mean that it's a victory for Canis Rex. The knight itself might be left in smouldering ruins, but provided he doesn't get super unlucky, Sir Hector himself will be able to walk away from things. Victory to Canis Rex then, the first of these combatants to be able to bring down the Primarch of the World Eaters, due to a big amount of damage and an ejector seat built into the knight that the others seem to have forgotten. That might be the force of the Imperium, but there's far scarier threats out there in the ranks of Chaos and Xenos, and leading the way for the Chaos Space Marines we have none other than Abaddon the Despoiler himself, star of my previous video like this, and an absolute murder machine of a combat character with some really unnatural abilities. His 350 points and hits like a truck, 9 attacks with his Warlord trait, and he gets to use his own 4 rerolls on himself, rerolling all hits and wounds with Dracnian. Against a lot of targets, he's just quite likely to stack around 8 or 9 wounds worth of damage, each of them dealing 3 wounds if they fail their save, plus the chance for some mortals as well. On top of that though, he's spectacularly hard to kill. The Nurgle mark means that you can only ever wound him on 3s. Once per turn, the Tzeentch mark means that you can negate a failed save, but most importantly, you can't deal more than 3 wounds to him in any single phase of the game. He's got a damage cap that Angron is really going to hate. As a result, all Angron's rage can only manifest itself in 3 wounds on the Despoiler. It makes a bit more sense to use the sweep profile just for sheer reliability, just throwing loads and loads of failed saves at Abaddon so the Mark of Tzeentch negating 1 doesn't make the biggest difference. And with around 24 wounds on Abaddon, it's kind of unlikely that he's going to get anything but the 3 damage cap for that phase. Still though, it's definitely disappointing for Angron not to be able to do all that melee damage to his full potential, and unlike some of the other combatants on this list, he doesn't have any option for multi-phase damage. In return, Abaddon goes in with 4 rerolls to hit and wound. It does mean that the Talon of Horus's shooting do take a decent chunk out of him, but really the main event is Dracnian, 11.6 wounds just out of its normal damage output, plus an average of around 4 mortal wounds due to the 6s you're likely to roll. Overall it clocks in at just under 18 wounds. It's got a very good chance of just one-shotting the Demon Primarch if he rolls well, and due to that crafty damage cap, he winds up over tripling out Angron, 99% versus 33. I certainly saw this sort of thing coming with these matchups. Only having 1 phase worth of damage, Angron really is going to struggle against anything that has a damage cap. Games Workshop did seem to just want to keep his melee damage just nice and normal but loads of it, as opposed to giving him rules like ignoring invuls or ignoring damage caps. All the Chaos faction leaders are kind of big and scary though. Next up we've got Demon Primarch Mortarion, Angron facing off against another one of his brothers. There's definitely some similarities on the stat line between Angron and Mortarion. They both have 18 wounds and big damage attacks that get D3 plus 3 damage. Mortarion costs a decent amount more points at 450, and Mortarion does have a few other things going for him, like psychic powers, the lantern pistol, and of course massive defense, toughness 8, -1 damage, a 4 plus invul, and then even a 5 plus feel no pain. That little lot tends to make quite a lot of damage go away. In combat he'll be striking with his Scythe Silence, a huge strength 16, AP -4, damage D3 plus 3 and plague weapon. He'll be able to re-roll the hit rolls and the wound roll for some spectacularly reliable damage. In combat, Angron isn't going to be getting his rerolls this time. Mortarion gets to pick a Plague Warlord trait, and the Globing Bloats turns off rerolls. On top of that, Mortarion will also try and reduce Angron's chance of hitting him a bit further, using Miasma of Pestilence as a psychic power, as a counter for the chance of it going off or failing. With all those crazy barriers to damage, Angron only averages just over 8 wounds with his damage D3 plus 3, 45% damage to the Primarch of Nurgle. In return though, Mortarion can hit back very hard. As mentioned, he casts Miasma to make him -1 to hit, and then smites for some mortal wounds. The lantern chips off a single wound on average, but Silence really does some good work in the combat phase. Very reliable D3 plus 3 damage hits, and he averages 19.5 wounds overall, killing Angron. Overall it's fairly impressively skewed numbers, 108% versus 45%, and even waiting for points it doesn't get a lot closer, it's still a 192% victory to Mortarion. From Nurgle to Tzeentch though, and next up we have Magnus, 420 points and a similar Demon Primarch type stat line. Magnus doesn't have quite as much defense as Mortarion, only toughness 7 and -1 damage, but no 5 plus feel no pain. In combat he strikes with the Blade of Magnus, strength 16, AP -4, damage 3, and the chance for some mortal wounds. and he gets 8 attacks with that. Really, Magnus's thing is all about the psychic powers though, and he has access to 18 out of the Codex, plus his improved smite, the Gaze of Magnus. That gets d6 damage normally, or a crazy 3d3 if he casts it high, which is quite likely to do with his casting bonus. He gets a +2 to cast, and re-rolling the psychic cast if he fails it, so things are almost guaranteed to go off there. When battle is joined, Angron does significantly more damage to Magnus than he can Mortarion, getting almost 17 wounds on the sorcerer. Magnus will cast -1 to hit on himself with the Glamour of Tzeentch, 93% damage, almost killing Magnus but not quite. In return though, Magnus can hit back very hard indeed. Twist of Fate is perhaps the nastiest one. That'll remove Mortarion's invuls in combat, so he'll be saving on a 6, not a 4. He uses his improved Gaze of Magnus smite, and also Glamour of Tzeentch for the -1 to hit. It works out as a bit better than things like Doombolt. Then in combat, with Mortarion having no invul save, the Blade of Magnus really can hit very hard. It averages 16 wounds, and between that and the psychic damage, you'd expect 19.5, just overcoming Angron and killing him at 108% damage versus 93. Victory to Magnus on a one-on-one basis there, but I did find it interesting that they're almost directly balanced if you wait for points. 360 points on Angron's part versus 420 for Magnus. I feel that the lack of psychic defense on his base profile really does cost Angron here though. If he could get that 5+ save against mortal wounds or the chance to deny things from stratagems, both of those would have been quite good, but then I guess Magnus will be having extra tricks of his own as well. Lastly, for the very big and murderous threats of Chaos, we have Be'lakor, the undivided demon prince, the Dark Master of Chaos. This guy's a big scary supreme commander of the Chaos demons, 420 points, very scary combat with the Blade of Shadows. He strikes at 6 attacks at strength 12, AP 4 and damage d3 +3, ignoring invul saves, which will be relevant. With all of his shadowy things though, Be'lakor is also spectacularly hard to kill. 20 wounds at toughness 7, -1 to hit and wounds. The opponent can't re-roll any rolls, which will affect Angron, and he gets his 4+ demon save after that. He also casts a couple of psychic powers, could be helpful for a few mortal wounds. Against Be'lakor, Angron's damage output is definitely blunted a bit. No re-rolls, -1 to hit and -1 to wound all do take out a chunk, but even so he gets around about 3 wounds through with his slash attack, averaging just under 15 wounds, 72% damage overall. When Be'lakor hits back though, he does hit back very hard, nowhere near quite as much psychic damage as Magnus. He has Void Slivers and Smites just to deal some mortal wounds. The rest of them aren't really all that useful as he already has -1 to wound built into his profile. Then the Blade of Shadows is perhaps kinda similar to Magnus's attacks in combat, 16 wounds on average, ignoring the invuls, so Angron saves on a 6+ with his 2+ save, averaging out at 19 wounds of Angron's 18, again just slightly killing the Demon Primarch. Overall, Be'lakor wins this round, 105% to 72% on the damage front, and even if you wait for points, he is still slightly ahead, and 125% victory to Be'lakor there, though it is quite close. So being somewhat chastened and cast down by the other 4 big bads out of the Chaos Codexes, Angron's now off into Xenos land, and his first opponent here is the Avatar of Khaine. This shard of a Craftworld Eldar deity is rather potent in combat, pretty much a straight melee brawler, toughness 8, 14 wounds, and a 4+ invul and defense, and he halves incoming damage with his molten body. On the offensive, he strikes at a big strength 14, AP -5, and damage d6 +2 with a Wailing Doom. 7 attacks with that is really quite powerful. Plus he also gets to fire off a shot at a similar kind of profile. In combat, that half damage rule means that Angron's better off using his sweep attack rather than his slash. There's not much in it, but the sweep attack averages 13 wounds, slightly over the 12 or so that the slash gets. It doesn't quite average you 1 dead avatar in a single round of combat, 13 out of 14 wounds, or 91% damage. In return, the Avatar certainly got a scary amount of big damage d6 +2 attacks. Anything that goes through will sting quite a bit. The Wailing Doom with the shooting averages 1.5 wounds, and the combat averages 13.3. It's not quite enough though, and Angron's left standing on 3 wounds remaining, 82% damage versus 91, so a victory for Angron. This is one where the points cost will swing things though. The Avatar does cost significantly less at 280 over 360, so if you wait for points the Avatar wins, but if it's just on the raw model versus model, it's a victory for the Red Angel of the World Eaters. While we're in Eldar land, I thought we'd fight against the Yncarne as well. This one's the Avatar of the Inari and shares a few special rules with the Avatar of Khaine, halving damage and getting a 4+ invul. The Yncarne's perhaps a bit more complex than the avatar of Khaine though, getting a small shooting attack, a couple of psychic powers, and then a rather vicious sword in melee that's damage D3+3 and ignores invuls like Be'lakor all over again. Overall, Angron's damage against the Eldar Death God does slightly more than against the avatar of Khaine. Being toughness 7 rather than toughness 8 means that Angron wounds him on 2s, 14 wounds compared with the Yncarne's 12, 116% damage there. In return, the Yncarne does a fair amount of damage in multiple phases. They smite for just under 2 wounds, attempts to cast Ancestor's Grace for a +1 to wound in combat, and the Swirling Soul Energy shooting attack does just under a wound as well. The Sword of Souls, taking into account the chance of the +1 to wound, does most of the work though, just under 16 wounds, so on average just about slays Angron, 18.7 wounds compared with the Primarch's 18. Overall, it's still a slight victory for Angron, 116% damage versus 104%, though again if you wait for points it turns into an Yncarne victory, so it depends if you're going for the per point or the model versus model fight. Seeing as we don't have Vect for the Drukhari, let's throw Drazhar into the ring and see how he does, pretty much the premier Drukhari fighter. He's 145 points, isn't enormously spectacular in terms of defense, a 2+ save, 4+ invul and -1 damage, but he really is quite potent in terms of his melee, potentially fighting twice with 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 3, all with +1 to wound, and using his Hatred Eternal Warlord trait re-rolling all hits and wound rolls, so you are going to convert most of those. Certainly not bad at all for 145 points, you can definitely punch up. In combat, Angron's certainly not going to have too much trouble laying him low. The slash attack, even with the -1 damage, averages you 21 wounds versus his 6, 350% damage there. You've got 1 dead Drazhar. And then Drazhar in return gets the Executioner Demiclaves. Not a bad effort to be fair, 5.5 wounds if he fights, and if he fights twice then he gets 11 wounds, kinda depends on what rules you've got for the contest here. He doesn't have to fight at the end of the fight phase, but I guess if the first round of combat has both been done simultaneously, he's probably not going to live to fight to the second. Even if we are generous though, he doesn't kill Angron in a turn, though he does deal a decent amount of damage, 350% versus 61%, and that's still a sweeping victory to Angron, even if you wait for points. Tyranids next, and the Swarmlord steps into the ring. A pretty mighty Tyranid leaderbug with toughness 8, 13 wounds and a 2+ save. He is really going to be quite hard to kill, as he's going to try and cast Catalyst on himself for a 5+ feel no pain, and also has a rather nice blade parry special rule where you get to negate 1 single wound, turning one of Angron's big D3+3 damage attacks into 0. In return, he's going to hit you with a whole load of Bone Sabers, a big 9 attacks at strength 9, AP 4 and damage 3. Hard to go too far wrong with that. He gets to choose his high fleet as well, so I've chosen to make him Leviathan for the purposes of this contest. Pretty nice for getting transhuman physiology. With all that going on, Angron actually has kind of spectacularly low damage output against him. Only wounding on a 4+ is quite a big deal. Then the Swarmlord's got their invul save, plus the 83% chance of Catalyst for the 5+ feel no pain, and again losing that attack. It still makes more sense to use the D3+3 damage profile, still outweighing the 1 damage one, but not by much. When the dust settles, it's 7.7 wounds out of a total of 13 on the Swarmlord. In return for the Psychic, the Swarmlord's casting Catalyst and Smite, then goes in with the Bone Sabers for an extra 8 wounds on average. It tots up to be just under 10 wounds total of 18, 55% damage on Angron. A really very close contest this one, just a win for Angron over the Swarmlord. Though again with the much cheaper points cost, if you did wait for points then it will be a Swarmlord win, but not on an individual model basis. Moving on, we've got Ghazghkull Thraka, 300 points worth of Apex Greenskin Might. He'll fire off 16 shots with Mork's Roar at strength 5, AP -1, and then in combat he's got Gork's Claw, strength 14, AP 4 and damage 4, with a Warlord trait to get him up to 6 attacks and Goff's Exploding 6s. He gets to re-roll his hit rolls for free, and on the defensive he's got one of those rather unfriendly special rules to stop you taking more than a certain amount of damage in one turn. Definitely bad news for Angron with only 1 phase worth of damage. Again for Angron it's kind of predictable here. Either profile near guarantees you maxing 4 wounds on Ghazghkull, but his slightly plot armory damage cap stops it getting any further. In return, Ghazghkull's Mork's Roar chips around half a wound off Angron, then he goes in with Gork's Claw, which is far more effective. It's got enough strength to wound Angron on 2s, and it averages around about 12 wounds on the targets. Overall, he does just over 2/3 of Angron's wound profile, winning the battle 68% to 33, and it gets even better if you waited for points. I'm sure Angron is forever cursing the day that Games Workshop didn't decide to give him something to ignore caps on damage like this. To make him feel better about things though, next up we've got the smallest combatant on Angron's hit list. I thought we'd give Uthar the Destined a go for the Leagues of Votann, 160 points as a high car. He attacks with a Vulcanite Disintegrator and a Blade of the Ancestors that allows him to do mortal wounds on hit rolls, and he's got really quite an interesting and powerful durability rule where every single damage result against him counts as 1. Really quite nice when you've got 6 wounds. Unfortunately for him, that's going to be absolutely no use against Angron, who can hit you with 39 damage 1 attacks, which is what he's going to do. In combat, using his sweep attack, that means that he'll do 16 wounds on average. All the damage becomes 1, so it doesn't make sense to use the D3 plus 3 damage profile. It easily kills Uthar, 16 wounds versus 6. Uthar does at least have the ability to put out a few mortal wounds. At the start of the turn, he puts down a judgment token so he can wound Angron automatically on a 5+. That's one of the benefits of the Greater Thurian League. His Vulcanite Disintegrator should score just more than a wound, and the Blade of the Ancestors with the mortal wounds on it, he will use his Destined ability for an automatic 6 on one of those. Overall, he scores a total of 6.4 wounds of Angron's 18, 36% damage versus 266, overwhelming victory to the Demon Primarch here, again as I think most people might have predicted. To keep his confidence up with the easy wins, next up we have the Tau. This was never going to be a good matchup whichever way we went here. We could have gone for Shadowsun or Ornvar arguably, but they would have fared even worse. But I guess just to give them a slightly more combat ready character, I thought we'd go for Farsight for this one. At least he's got a little bit of combat prowess. He attacks with a high intensity plasma rifle, 2 shots at damage 3 and strength 8. Then in combat he strikes with that Dawn Blade of Mysterious Providence, strength 10, AP -3 and damage 3 with his 5 attacks, hitting on 2s, unheard of melee combat for Tau. He isn't really particularly tough on the defensive though, just the 7 wounds and the 4+ invul save. He isn't really going to have a great time out of this. In combat, Angron deals 371% damage to Farsight, 26 wounds compared with his total of 7. And then in return, Farsight can only do so much. Plasma rifles will average you 1.7 wounds, the Dawnblade another 4.2. He takes off around about a third of Angron's health, but again, even despite having much less points, he gets nowhere near. 33% damage plays 371, big win for the Demon Primarch. Lastly, but far from least, we have the Necrons. Here I thought we'd give them 2 different entries, the Silent King and the Nightbringer. One the faction leader, and the other one arguably their best character headhunter. First up we've got Zarek the Silent King. He's just an all-around strong combatant. 400 points gets you a couple of big Annihilator beams with those Triarchal Menhirs, and then each of his members of the Triarch hit pretty well as well. He'll do a bit of damage at range and melee with the staff, as will his underlings. On the defensive, including those Menhirs, he does have 26 wounds at toughness 7 with a 4+ invul. He also has a powerful debuff making the enemy fight last as well, meaning that if battle is joined at the same time, Angron will be fighting after him. In combat, it makes more sense to go for the slash profile with the big damage. This one gives him a reasonable chance of one-shotting a Menhir. But just for a tiny spoiler as to what's coming up in a second, Angron will be bracketed by the time that he gets to strike. The Silent King gets to hit him first due to the obeisance generators, and it means that Angron's only getting 11 attacks rather than his usual 13. The Triarchal Menhirs also pose a little bit more of a durability addition. He's got a 1 in 3 chance to underkill them, only dealing 4 wounds when he needs 5. I have counted in the chance for it to eat up an extra attack potentially. Overall though, the Silent King really is hit pretty hard by this, 19 wounds out of his total of 26, and both the Menhirs taken down. In return though, the Silent King does have quite a lot of abilities to throw at Angron. No longer being core, he doesn't get his own rerolls anymore, but still his damage output is fairly potent. The Annihilator beams will deal 6 wounds if they get a single hit through, they average around 4, and then on the actual days itself we've got the Silent King's Scepter and the Staff, dealing another 3 wounds between them. Then in combat, both the Scythe of Dusk and the Silent King's Scepter are rather strong as well. Between the 3 Triarch members you average around about 7 wounds, dealing around 14 wounds out of 18 to Angron overall. Overall, this one's really quite close, 77% damage for the Silent King against Angron, but only 73% for Angron against the Silent King. Overall, it works out as a victory for Mr. Zarek. If you waited for points, Angron would technically catch up a bit, as it is a bit close, though realistically, if it goes on to another round, Angron will likely be dead before he gets to strike, as the Silent King gets to hit him first due to those obeisance generators. Even when bracketed, Zarek is odds on to kill him first. Really quite a tight contest this one though. Lastly, to close the curtain on Angron's rampage through the faction commanders, we have the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer, 320 points worth of Necron Death God, and he's just scary all the way around for Angron. In combat, his Scythe of the Nightbringer strikes at strength 14, AP 4 and damage d6, ignoring invuls. He blasts out a whole bunch of mortal wounds with the powers of the Catan, and worst of all, he's got the Necrodermis special rule, capping Angron's damage output at 3 wounds. There's not a whole load of characters that can stand against him in 40k and hope to come out on top. In combat, Angron's near guarantees to max the damage cap, though we'll bear in mind that the Nightbringer heals with the Necrodermis 1 wound every 2 player turns, so I've taken off half a wound for that. Overall, it's only 27% damage, again Angron very frustrated against arbitrary things that stop him hitting the enemy even harder in this phase. With rules like that in play, the Nightbringer doesn't have to work too hard for this. His character killing rules are rather good though. Between Antimatter Meteor and Gaze of Death, you're averaging around about 3 wounds, and then the Scythe of the Nightbringer is pretty reliable in combat, 12.1 wounds ignoring Angron's invul save, and giving you a total of 15 wounds of 18. It's 83% for the Nightbringer versus 27 for Angron. I feel like with these character contests, you never really want to go fighting against a death god. It's not usually going to wind up well for you. So there we have the final results then, Angron versus every faction leader in Warhammer 40k, and I must admit I was actually kind of slightly surprised how he came off second best in quite so many of these. I think it was kind of easy to predict that the damage cap characters would probably beat him, but it seems that the raw numbers tend to work out lower against a whole load of the other big threats out there. There's quite a long list of people that beat Angron either per model or per points. For the list of the ones who killed Angron, we've got the Nightbringer, Silent King, Magnus, Mortarion, Be'lakor, Abaddon, Ghazghkull, and Canis Rex. Canis Rex if you do count Sir Hector getting out, and you don't count the Knight as the dead thing. Furthermore, the Swarmlord, Yncarne, and Avatar of Khaine did more per point in terms of damage than Angron did, so I guess they can claim some kind of victory from that as well. As I said at the start, I feel like they perhaps needed to balance Angron's raw damage and defense stats with the fact that he can be turning up every turn in the World Eater's army if you have Blood Tithe points. That might be one explanation for why he's getting killed a fair bit by some of the equivalent models. I'm sure a bunch of these guys would still be pretty dismayed if they did manage to kill Angron and then he just turned up for another go next turn. Having the army-wide special rule be Blood Tithe as well is kind of unhelpful for this kind of contest. It's basically stronger the larger games that you get, and when you're playing about the smallest possible game like this, it's going to be the least help. Finally, here's just a list of damage per point versus Angron. The Nightbringer, Abaddon and Ghazghkull with their damage caps all win this out, and then Mortarion and the Swarmlord follow up after that. Trailing the bottom of the table, we've got Uthar the Destined, Farsight, Lord Solar, and Belisarius Cawl getting smashed the hardest. Maybe not the most surprising there, as most of those aren't exactly renowned for being combat characters. In any case, it's been good fun just to smash some models and numbers together. Let me know what you make of Angron's victories and losses down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and the support on that is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.